Hey guys, welcome to another episode of The Vinyl Den, your channel for record collecting by record collectors. I'm Nick. Today, we're talking about some forgotten 90s classics. There's a bunch of links down below. You got links for the Vinyl Den Facebook group, for the merch page, for the Spotify and Apple Music playlist that I put together every week, and the Patreon page. So make sure you check all that out. Like always, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button down below. Make sure you hit that notification bell so you're notified every time I release new episodes. I think the 90s were an incredible decade for music. There are so many great bands, and really if you look at the decade as a whole, there was such a huge musical evolution from the beginning of the decade to the end. And there are so many albums along the way that, 25 plus years later, I think have kind of largely been forgotten about. And yes, if you're a huge fan of these bands and these albums, of course you didn't forget them, but I think mainly, largely the mainstream has. So I'm going to start out earlier in the decade, 1982, with America's Least Wanted by Ugly Kid Joe, something I didn't realize until just recently, and I'm sure this is probably something that everyone's known for 30 plus years, is the name Ugly Kid Joe is actually a spoof on the glam rock band Pretty Boy Floyd's name. I'm not really sure why. I never put all that together, but I just think it's kind of a funny thing. Of course, this album is known for Cats in the Cradle and Everything About You. Those are two classic tracks off this album, but this is one that I hadn't listened to in a very long time until I just recently picked up this unofficial pressing of it. This is a lot better of an album than I remember it being. And then the next album is one where I feel like it was really popular for a really short period of time, and then even by the middle part of the decade, it was really kind of forgotten about. This one came out back in 1993, and that's Kerosene Hat by Cracker. Cracker was one of those bands that I think really tried to pick up the torch of rock music in that post-Nirvana era. Low was a huge track off this album. I think it's probably the one track that everyone knows from Cracker. The album hit, I think, number 59 on the Billboard 200. So they had a lot of success with this album. And then I think as quickly as they came onto the scene, they kind of disappeared. I will say that I think as good as this album is, their album that came out, I think it was 2 albums later. It's called Gentleman's Blues. I think it's an even better album overall. It was released in 1998, and I think it was probably one of the better, under-the-radar albums for the later part of the decade. The next 3 albums were all released in 1994. This next one is easily one of my favorite albums of the 90s overall, and that was Rotting Pinata by Sponge. So I came across Sponge probably shortly after this album came out. I was in high school, and it was called Channel 1. It was like this news program that they would play every morning during homeroom, and they had Sponge on there. I think they were interviewed by Anderson Cooper, which he got his start on there also, but that's where I first heard the band. They played a couple of tracks. Of course, Plowed and Molly were the 2 big singles off this album, but this is easily a 10 out of 10 album for me. There's not a bad track on here. And it's still, 30 plus years later is one of my favorite albums. An album that I didn't listen to for a very long time until after it was released, also released in 1984, is Grace by Jeff Buckley. Of course, it was because of the title track is why I started listening to this album. But it was probably almost 10 years after this album was released that I finally got around to listening to the entire thing. And this is one of those albums where, Jeff unfortunately died in 1997. Listening to this album even today makes me think, what could have been with his career had he lived, because this album is just an absolute brilliant piece. If I'm being honest, the next album, it was never huge. I just have really fond memories of it, and that is a self-titled debut album from G Love and Special Sauce. So they are like this laid-back rock blend with hip-hop and soul and some blues in there. The song Cold Beverage, I think, was the only one that ever got any kind of radio play. And the way I came across this album was, in the middle part of the 90s, one of my friends didn't have cable. So his aunt would record MTV, just random videos on VHS tape for him. And then I'd sit, hang out over his house, and we'd just watch these videos. The video came across for Cold Beverage, and ever since then, I've just been hooked on this album. And then moving ahead one year to 1995, you've got American Standard by 7 Mary 3. So this is easily their best known album. Cumbersome was the big track on this one, but I think Water's Edge was another. It didn't get as much radio play as Cumbersome, but I remember hearing it a lot also. I think they're another one of those bands that popped up in the middle part of the decade, really trying to carry the mantle in the post-grunge era. They didn't stick around quite as long as, they probably think they should have, but this is another one of those albums where, kind of going back through it, I was really only familiar with a couple tracks on there. But it's another really good album. There's, I think, some even better tracks on there than what the album is known for. So in 1996, Eagles would release their album Beautiful Freak. So this was their fourth album, but this was the first album they went by Eels. The first three albums, they were just known as E. The thing I found really surprising about this band is they've already released 20 albums. This is the only album of theirs I think I've ever listened to beginning to end. I've listened to a couple, I guess a handful of their tracks over the last couple of years because they've been reissuing several albums across their career that have been out of print for a long time. And they're another one of those bands I need to go back through more of their discography because, yes, they're known for the song Novocaine for the Soul, but I've enjoyed a lot of the other songs I've listened to from them also. This next one's pretty obscure. There's probably very few people out there that have heard of this album or have listened to this album. This was released in 1997, and this is a self-titled debut album from After School Special. This is actually the only album the band ever released. The band is fronted by the late David Jones, who I think was probably better known for the punk band Enemy U. And if you're a fan of really early Green Day, I'd say like pre-Kerplunk Green Day, I think you'll be a big fan of this album. This is one I just came across within the last couple of years. This just got reissued, I think, for the first time ever on vinyl within the last couple of years. It was only available on CD when it was first released. It has a different cover also. It's not available on any streaming service. You can go on YouTube and listen to this album, though. But somebody posted about it in the Final Den Facebook group and said, hey, if they knew I was a punk fan. They were like, hey, you need to check out this band. I listened to a couple tracks and fell in love with this album. I had to order it right away. But even for a mid-90s punk album, it's rough. It is a rough-sounding album. But I think that's what really lends itself to the greatness, I think, of this album overall. So by the later part of the decade, I was really big into ska and punk. One of my favorite ska albums of all time was released in 1998, and that is Songs from Suburbia by Spring Heel Jack. And I think of all the third wave ska albums in the 90s, I think this is probably the most underrated one. And I think this is the only album of theirs I've listened to. They've got two other albums. I don't think I've listened to any of it. The song Jolene was the song that got me into this album. I remember I was at one of my friends' houses. We were watching one of those, like, it wasn't MTV, but it was like one of those alternate MTV channels. And the video for Jolene popped up, and it was really kind of, it's a fun song. It was a fun video. And I listened to this album, and front to back, there's not a bad track on it. It's one of those 10 out of 10 third wave ska albums in the 90s. Now I'm going to round out my list with an album from 1999, and that is A Place in the Sun by Lit. My Own Worst Enemy was the big track off this one. I think it's the one track that everyone knows from Lit, but Lit is another one of those bands that's released a lot of really good music across their career. It just happened to be this was their only album of theirs that really gained any kind of traction. It reached number 31 on the Billboard 200, and this is an album that was very influential in the very early part of the 2000s. I know Good Charlotte said this album was a big influence on them going into the release of their debut album. And that ended up being one of my favorite punk albums of the early part of the 2000s. And this album is a big reason why that album has the sound it does. Well, that's all I got for you today, guys. Thanks for checking the show out. Make sure you drop me a comment down below. Let me know what you guys think are some other great, underrated classic albums from the 90s. There's a lot of other ones. This probably I could do, an even longer list than the ones I said today because, like I said, it was a great decade. Not only a great decade for rock, it was a great decade for rap. It was a great decade for R&B. It was a great decade for country music. So this list definitely could have been a lot longer, but let me know what some of your favorites are. Like always, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button down below. That's all I got. Until next time, keep on spinning. Peace.